Q10 gardening, everybody. I'm here in my community garden plot, ready to do one of the biggest harvests here that we do each season at the community garden, and that is our winter squash. Now, for those of you who are brand new to our community garden space, we have a bunch of videos from the past 2 seasons where we've been growing different vegetables out here in a community garden spot that costs us about $75 each season, and it's a really nice space with over 1,000 square feet. And the last couple of seasons, we've really focused on growing winter squash out here because they take up quite a bit of space that we don't have at our own property. Now, so far this season, we've already harvested about 150 ears of corn, about 30 really nice onion plants. We've also come out and we've harvested some tomatoes, some beautiful different varieties of tomatoes that were absolutely fantastic. We still have to harvest the sweet potatoes that are in here, but that's not going to be for a little while yet. But I'm ready to harvest some of our winter squash and show you the different varieties and talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of each one. Now, we made a mistake last season and we waited a little bit too long for some of our winter squash. We got a light frost and it actually drastically affected the storage time of a lot of our winter squash. We had some splitting, we had all kinds of issues. So this season we haven't had a day below about 45 degrees, or I should say a night below 45 degrees. And most of our winter squash, from what I can tell, is ready to be harvested. And so we're gonna go ahead and get that taken care of now. I'm gonna be harvesting all these different varieties. We're gonna get a nice overall weight as well. That's something we love to do. Last season we had about 200 pounds. I can tell you that I have noticed that they've struggled a little bit more. Our winter squash has struggled a little bit more this season. You know, that early dry spell after we got them planted didn't help at all. But I think we're still gonna get a nice harvest. We got some new varieties in here, or rather maybe some varieties we haven't talked about so much. But before I start harvesting, I should also say, if you're looking for a video about knowing when to harvest, knowing when your winter squash are ripe, and also a video talking about curing, we have one for you, and we'll put a link to that in the description, and I'll try to remember to tag it right here. Now, when you're harvesting winter squash, it's important to have the right kind of pruners, because if you don't have something strong enough or sharp enough and you try to cut, you may end up busting the end off of the squash, and that opens up that interior of the squash to potential for rotting, etc., and definitely reduces the amount of storage life. Well, pretty obviously, I'm in a different place all of a sudden. It was just so windy out there that even though I recorded the harvesting of a lot of this, I didn't want to talk over that wind. So we're here at home, but I've got my harvest with me, and I'm going to tell you exactly how much we ended up getting, and it was better than I expected. So the first variety is this early autumn hybrid squash. Now, each of these squash are typically somewhere between 3 to 8 pounds in weight, and in my opinion, this is the most beautiful winter squash that we grow. It's got that really nice orangish yellow color mixed in with these spots and lines. And there's a little bit of green left on here, but this one is nice and mild tasting. It's got like a nutty, kind of creamy texture to it. And this one we typically treat pretty similarly to a butternut squash in how we eat it. That is to say, we eat this one most often roasted, although I've read you can eat it mashed, and that's something I want to try this season. Well, I mentioned butternut squash, so that's what we've got next up. We've got a butternut squash. I think this is like the go-to, probably the most common winter squash that a lot of people are out there eating. And for us, I would say we usually get these somewhere between 3 to, ready for this, 8 to 10 pounds for these. So 3 to 10 pounds. This one is about 4 pounds, maybe closer to 5 pounds. We've got some even bigger than this in our garden here, because we actually grew some winter squash here as well. And you know that this has that nice nutty flavor. And most typically for us, again, we eat this one roasted. I'll tell you what, in terms of size of the squash, the early autumn hybrid and the butternut are the 2 biggest ones that we grow. And this season, the butternut was actually our most productive, but I'll get to numbers in just a little bit. Now, similar in taste to the butternut squash, we have this Canada crookneck. Now, you can obviously see there's a pretty substantial difference in terms of the shape of this squash, and the location of the meat is also somewhat different, because most of the meat of this winter squash isn't here. As you can see, most of it's up here in the neck. The neck of the squash is solid. There are no seeds up here. All of the seeds are contained down in this part of the squash, and so this part is similar to the inner part of the butternut squash in terms of, you know, the amount, probably a ½ inch or so of meat that you can eat in here, and all of this is absolute deliciousness. Taste-wise, again, very similar to the butternut squash. Now this year we also grew this sugar pumpkin. This is really closely related to the winter squash. And in terms of taste, this one is much sweeter and less fibrous than those bigger carving pumpkins that you're prone to buy. And this one did really well for us this season. I actually didn't initially plant as many of these as we ended up getting, but we had a couple die back because of that early dry spell. And so we brought in a couple more of these. These are super sweet. And this is the first of the winter squash where I'm gonna say, for this variety, not only is it nice and sweet, but I like eating, we like to roast these and we like to steam them, and I like eating these with the skin on. Now that's one of the things to note about this type of pumpkin. Not everybody likes to do that, but this one, for some reason, I like the skin on these when I've got them roasted. Now the average weight for this sugar pumpkin is somewhere between 3 to 5 pounds, though we have some that are smaller. I would say this one is probably about 3.5 pounds right here. And that definitely brings me to the other two varieties, which are also varieties where I like to leave the skin on when we roast them or however, and I like to eat that skin. I don't do it for the butternut. I don't do it for the Canada crookneck. This is the delicata squash. The delicata squash is sweet. Some people say that this is comparable to, it's like a mix between a sweet potato and a winter squash, and I would agree. It's got that really nice sweetness. It's creamy, and again, the skin of this is really quite tasty. Now these are typically only about a pound, at least that's what our experience has been. So they're smaller, but we've also found that when the plant does well, you can get 10 or 12 of these off of a single plant. And finally, we have our kabocha squash. And kabocha squash is another one of those squash that are really popular, at least here in Zone 5, Wisconsin. Your butternut and your kabocha are incredibly popular. This one is also nice and sweet. It's not that fibrous. Now, you've heard a pretty common theme repeated here about how we eat our winter squash, which is roasted or steamed. And again, the delicata, the kabocha, really delicious with the skin on, in my opinion. Similarly, the sugar pumpkin, but that's because, you know, those are simple ways to take in some really great nutrients from your winter squash. And on top of that, they're such hearty vegetables, in my opinion. And there's plenty of other ways that you can try them out. I would say that if I had to rank these, and I'm going to rank these right now for my preference based on taste, and this is just me, this isn't my whole family, but in terms of taste, I'm going to say first is the delicata, second is the Canada crookneck, third is the kabocha squash, fourth is the sugar pumpkin, fifth is the butternut squash, and sixth is the early autumn hybrid. Though to be fair, with every single one of these, I absolutely love the taste. So that ranking doesn't mean that the sixth one doesn't taste good. It just means that the other ones are even better. All right, I will tell you that our biggest producer this season was our butternut squash at just over 107 pounds. And overall, and I told you at the beginning of this video, I was a little bit worried about the harvest, but we planted enough plants to overall get 237 pounds of winter squash. That is a ton, okay, a tenth of a ton of good eating for our family this winter. And we got them early enough. There wasn't any kind of frost damage, so these should last. We've had them last 6, 7, 8 months easily, if not longer, in our basement. So we're gonna have some really good eating. Well, folks, we've made the decision to plant in our community garden because of the benefit of that space and what we can grow in it. And this is just another example of how that's paying off for us. Now, we'd love to hear from you. We have 6 different varieties of winter squash here. And if you've grown any or all of them, we'd love to know your preferences. Which ones do you think taste the best, and how do you prepare them? We're always in the market for new recipes, new ways of eating this squash. I tell you, we love our winter squash. So go ahead and leave a comment for us. We would love to hear from you. Hey folks, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, Remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, you're with us, you are good to grow.